Hey everybody, this is Jack Allwell with another money episode. Sorry I've been gone for a while, getting over a third bout with COVID, but happy to be back and discussing a book that I just finished called The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. And we're going to be discussing this book more in depth on the Brothers on Books podcast that should be airing in a few days. So you'll want to check that out. But I wanted to give my thoughts after finishing the book. Now, this book is about modern monetary theory, and that idea is that it's basically going against the idea that the US government, or a currency issuing government as opposed to a currency using government, has to obey by the normal household budgeting protocol, as in earning money before spending. Now, normal household, or the normal way of thinking about a government and how it works, is kind of like a household budget where you're taxing and borrowing before you're spending. Tax money comes in, you issue bonds, you get money that way, and then you have a pool of money that you then can go spend on roads, spend on all sorts of programs. The MMT thought, though, is that the spending really comes before. You spend on whatever. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter where it goes. You want to make sure it goes to what's needed. And then on the back end, you want to tax and borrow to stop inflation if you think it's going to be there. And their argument is not all spending creates inflation. So the book starts out, there's a great quote that I actually use a lot, but not in this way. They're trying to say that, well, I'll just read it. It's Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And Stephanie spent some time under Bernie Sanders and worked on the budgeting committee. And one thing she's trying to get across is that, the US government, we borrow in our own currency. We are not pegged to the gold standard anymore. There's nothing limiting how much we can print and spend. But the only thing we need to concentrate on is the inflation on the back end, and how do we mitigate that. So it's an interesting book. I don't know if I agree with it really. I mean, she brings up the example of there's another important man in the MMT world, a Mr. Mosler, and she's talking about an example of him in his house, and he's basically saying he'll pay his kids in his business cards to do chores around the house. And sure enough, the kids don't really grasp onto this. They're like, what can we use this for? And then he decides to initiate basically a tax on them, saying you have to pay 10 business cards per month, and he'll give X number of business cards for doing the dishes, for cutting the lawn, etc., etc. And basically they then, and if they don't pay, then they get penalized. They don't get certain rights to certain luxuries of this house. So it's kind of, in that framework, the kids would basically be like the US citizens. And you got to think to yourself, do you really want to be a kid getting enforced by an adult? Or are you the adult and you're really telling the people in charge what to do? Because in this analogy, it seems like Stephanie's trying to say that the government really should be dictating where the road is, what path the country's going on. Whereas I think a lot of people would argue, we're paying into this system, and the government's basically working for us, not the other way around. We are not working for the government. The government should be working for us because we are spending our time and energy being productive in the economy, and our tax money is going towards these representatives that we've elected to vote in our best interests. So she brings up that in the MMT world, it's very much viewed that a government deficit is not necessarily a bad thing, because that means it's a non-government surplus. And the thought is that, okay, if the government is spending money in a particular area, yes, one segment of the population is getting a benefit from that money going to them. For example, maybe road builders in a particular city. But on the flip side, the money that would then go to offset the possible inflation is coming from everyone. So then it's, you're socializing all these things to a very small part of the population, and that's where you could start getting this is borderline communism if the government is just picking and choosing where the money's going. There's many programs that she brings up, whether it be Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. Also, the idea of going from defined benefit, like a pension, to a more system that is to a system that is more concentrated in defined contribution, a la your 401ks or IRAs, where you're kind of on the hook. And there's just a lot of programs that she basically says could be solved just by basically printing and plugging the economy in those ways. And she says the people that kind of say like, well, Social Security won't be funded by, X year. And her argument is that there always will be funding. It's just a matter of Congress passing that, because I think it was FDR that actually established Social Security in 1935, and people were concerned about how it was going to be paid for, and there are special rules about how it would be paid for. And to reinforce that idea that Social Security was self-supporting, Social Security Act tied the payment of benefits to a payroll tax that was meant to show how the program would be paid for. And her argument is this kind of just feeds into the myth that it's getting paid for beforehand and not after the fact to fight the inflation. So the deficits that she says that matter are the good jobs deficit, savings deficit, the healthcare deficit, the education deficit, infrastructure, climate, and the democracy deficit. She says these are the real deficits that matter. And a lot of the solutions from an MMT lens involves the government just directing funds towards those areas. And some of them I highly disagree with, and we've talked about these items a lot on the Brothers on Books podcast and getting solved in ways outside of the government intervention. For example, the healthcare deficit in Never Pay the First Bill by Marshall Allen, he goes through ways on trying to make the healthcare costs more transparent and potentially unlocking the connection between your job and medical insurance, and then in some instances fighting claims in small claims court to offset the rising costs. Now the education deficit, when we talked with Jason Brown on the Brothers on Books podcast, he was going through how he got two debt-free degrees, and how you can too. And because Stephanie's saying that we should basically forgive the student loan debt, 1.6 or 7 trillion of student loan debt that's out there right now. And a lot of people would, or I think a lot of rational people would argue that debt wouldn't even be there had the government not gotten involved in the first place. And they had good intentions. Everyone should be able to go to school, okay? But when everyone starts taking debt out and everyone can get a loan, maybe not all of them should have gotten loans to go to school, and now they're hampered by debt. So instead of just repaying it, the thought should be, you need to look at school as an investment like any other investment. Do the costs, are they surpassed by the benefits? And hopefully there's less people that go to school, and then it brings the cost down for schools. So there needs to be a balancing act. Now, for infrastructure, I will say that the agencies that did the grading in this book gave America a very poor grade. I think it was like a D+, meaning a lot of repairs needed to be done soon, or there was going to be some major accidents. And we've seen some accidents in dams and bridges. So I think there does need to be, and that is something I could see the government stepping in to do, just because it's such a vast space. And but once again, it could be done just at the state level, the local level, also raising money through like a bond, for an infrastructure bond, or through taxes on the front end. But her argument is it could just be done now, and we could worry about the inflation and analyze the inflation implications beforehand, but try to plan a tax plan after the fact to offset that inflation. Climate, she seems to be the most aggressive towards, but it's just it seems so hypocritical from some of these people that talk about climate, in the sense that you're probably still driving cars, you're probably still flying, and I think if you really cared, you'd probably give up meat too, I would imagine, because but I would need to look at that some more. Another interesting concept, I think, is this idea of this like guaranteed work program if you get laid off, or on another scenario, you actually quit. Now, if you quit your current job, you are not entitled to unemployment, but if you got fired, normally I believe you are entitled to unemployment. But the idea through modern monetary theory is that a job would basically be guaranteed at a minimum wage, and you could get work immediately if you were fired or quit as a transition period. Now, I don't know. I don't know how it really differs from the unemployment program we currently have. I mean, you need to have an incentive to go back to work, and you also don't want to be really competing against private companies, I would think, because you're taking money away from them. And who's to say these people that join these programs do a good job? And what's the incentive to do a good job if you're guaranteed to get paid? So I just question that idea a little bit. But let me know if you like this episode, and I would definitely check out the deficit myth. I mean, I didn't really agree with a lot of the comments, but I really enjoyed her thinking. She's a very good writer, and as far as trying to get me persuaded to join the side, I think I'm on board that is actually how the government is working. I mean, you could see in COVID, March 2020, when all the stimulus went out, they didn't really like think like, okay, we need to raise taxes before we send this money out. They just sent it out like a bazooka. And now we're kind of needing to worry about the inflation on the back end. And I thought most people in government kind of assumed that's how things were operated, but it sounds like most people in government are still kind of catering to their voters by trying to propose neutral deficit proposals. So that was kind of interesting for me to read and think about, that a lot of the government officials still think of the government in terms of like a household budget. And I would prefer it to be like that. But once again, please like the episode and subscribe, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.